Her name was Rihanna Sinclair, a strange woman whose pale and freckled face always suggested a mixture of secrecy and suspicions. If I were to be honest with myself, she was rather pretty had she attempted to tame her wild mane of fiery red hair, which always looked as if it had been deprived of the luxury of combing for centuries. Growing up as the only child of my parents who were both devoted Protestant, I always relied on other people's judgment to determine what was considered acceptable and not. There was this lady in our small church who had always greeted my 6-year-old self with a huge hug and a kiss on both cheeks whenever we ran into her. I remember thinking how pretty she was when I got older. My brother Ian did not seem to share my unhealthy fixation with her. He found it repulsive for boys like ourselves to have the hots for a woman like her, given how ancient she was. She was only in her mid-30s. When I first saw Rowena, I knew right away there was something special and intriguing about her. I didn't need anybody to tell me how pretty she was. She might look a little bit unhinged at times, wandering in the forest alone, mumbling to herself while looking for wild mushrooms or any other plants whose strange sounding names she had either come up with herself or pronounced in such a way that their thick accent is sounding like gibberish. Usually she might have been, but she was beautiful, no doubt about it, if only she had smiled a little bit more. According to rumors that have been circulated among nosy middle-aged women in our little town, Rowena came from a small town named Tullycushin in Ireland, and she had decided to move here years before she ran away from her abusive and alcoholic husband. She lived all by herself in a small serene-looking cottage up on the hill known locally as Wyrhmhill, due north not too far from town. She lived all by herself in a small serene-looking cottage up on the hill known locally as Wyrhmhill, due north not too far from town, and barely interacted with everyone. She kept to herself most of the time, spending hours tending to her garden full of curious-looking plants. Occasionally, she would descend to the hill and walk into town to do weekly shopping, which involves the minimum of communication necessarily. There was only a few people who were willing to engage her in a casual conversation, and elsewhere in town they all had chosen to avoid her altogether. Most kids in our small town thought she was a little weird and eccentric, if not mad. Patrick Mullen had once voiced his concern to everyone who was willing to hear about Rihanna being a malicious witch who spent most of her time reciting trickery magic spells and brewing curious potions that enables her to transform herself into anything, including an animal. Some kids stupid enough to fall for this nonsense started making up stories of their own about her, which became more and more outlandish as they went on. Harry Rodson told us during recess that he had seen her walking on water in the middle of the night when he and his father went out fishing at the lake. Alexander Hudson swore that his older brother had once caught Rihanna in the middle of transforming herself into a pretty little red fox. I have to say, most of these kids are gullible idiots, or maybe they were just too scared of Patrick to call him out on his bullshit. I personally thought Patrick Mullen was a stinking little liar. He had always been one to come up with wild stories to impress everyone. Nobody knew for sure what Rihanna was actually up to and what had brought her all the way from far north to our town. But one thing's for sure, Patrick Mullen always seemed to enjoy inflicting as much pain as possible on other people. The other kids, including me, had always been on the receiving ends of his threats and intimidation for years. Each Sunday morning, they would always pass Rihanna's cottage on the way to the lake. They would throw rocks at her roof and call her a witch, as if challenging her to prove it. My mother always reminded me to be nice to everyone. Just because they're different doesn't mean you can mock or talk them down. So I never joined Patrick Mullen and his underlings' weekly spiteful parade to antagonize Rihanna, which gave him another excuse to treat me as if one of his favorite personal punching bags at school. He always got away with it, of course. His father was the richest and the fattest man in town. Nobody was stupid enough to attempt resistance or even sassing back. One Thursday afternoon after school, I was hurrying my way home because I didn't want to get caught in the storm where I heard somebody shouting my name. "Hey, Harold!" A voice rose behind an abandoned barn I was running by. I halted and looked over my shoulders to find Patrick and his usual sidekicks, staring at me with nasty, bloodthirsty grins on their stupid faces. He was carrying a baseball bat in which he prodded the walls of leaning against menacingly. "What do you want?" I chirped as they slowly made their way towards me. "What do you want?" He imitating me in a mocking baby-like voice. Both Alexander Hudson and Harry Rodson burst into a disgusting high-pitched pre-puberty laugh at his side. "Seriously, what do you want, Patrick?" I repeated in a shaky voice, glimpsing the magnitude of what is about to come. "You know what? I'm in the mood for a little kicking your bony ass after what that old bastard did to me in the class today," he retorted. His thin lips curved into an ugly smile which did not compensate for his lack of attractive facial features. He was of course referring to what happened to him today in math class when Mr. Faraday humiliated him in front of everybody for falling asleep. Everyone feared Mr. Faraday. He was a horrible and bitter man in his late 30s who would not hesitate to slap you hard across the face if you cross him. "And why was it my fault what he did to you? You deserved it. You were snoring like a farty pregnant cow," I said, glaring him down. The wind had picked up and the old gigantic oak tree looming over was gently swaying from side to side. "Well, you weren't saying anything to defend me. I stayed up late last night helping your little brother with his homework," he snapped. "Now I need to kick your ass to feel good again. You deserve to be punished. Right, kids?" Both Alexander and Harry nodded vigorously. I took a few steps away from them, still wondering how on earth kicking somebody's ass would make him happy. "Don't get so worked up. Why don't you just pop those pimples of yours in face and butt cheeks until your anger goes away?" I suggested half-heartedly, making that ugly grin of his face fade. I looked up in the dark gray sky and my heart fell as I realized I would not make it at home in time, both the storm arriving. "Stay where you are," Patrick yelled. "I'll just break some of your ribs and be on my way." They started sauntering towards me. I have to go home. I don't want my parents to be worried about me," I stuttered, trying to keep my distance from them. "I'll get them something else to worry about then. Little Harold having his tiny little ass kicked and leaving him paralyzed and unable to walk straight for the rest of the week." They all started laughing. "You have to catch me." "Don't you dare, I'll beat you to a pulp myself," he warned me, balling his tiny hands into a fist as if no longer unable to hold back the urge to lash out his anger at every part of my body. "You'll trip over your foot and fall rolling on your fat belly before you even touch me, Patrick. We know that. Your ass is too big for your non-existent personality." "Get him!" he shouted furiously, and the other kids started to lunge at me. I turned my heels immediately and started to run as fast as my feet could carry me. "Stop, you idiot!" I heard him yelling at me. "Stop or you'll regret this!" But I kept running towards the forest. I didn't even stop to retrieve my hat from the ground for when the gust of cold wind snatched it off my head. I ran and ran until I arrived at the small clearing where the wind was making weird wavy patterns in the grassy surface. I looked over my shoulders and watched them scurry fast into the undergrowth, dragging their heavy feet, shouting their horrible threats and warnings at me. But they're not fast enough for me. Huge droplets of freezing rain finally fell as I emerged from the tree line and started running towards the old bridge at the edge of the forest. The river was raging wildly beneath my feet as I kept running. "Stop, Harold!" I heard Patrick muffled screaming somewhere, beyond the thick current of rain in the forest behind me. I started running for the hills, hoping that something bad would happen to them, telling myself that they would fall and break their necks and that the old bridge would collapse as they ran across it. I turned left from the tall hills and that was shrouded in dense, low-hanging fog, wishing to find an old mine where I could hide until Patrick got tired of chasing me. But instead of stumbling across the rusty gate of an old cemetery where my brother and the other horny teenagers in our town usually spent hours making out at night until it got too cold and they were forced to call it a night, I was through the open gate and found myself running behind the slated, weather-beaten headstone at the farthest end of the cemetery. My whole body was sodden, and I knelt down and shivered vigorously. I thought of my mother, who would not be pleased to see me coming home in wet school clothes. Not that I hadn't had a good explanation to her. I waited patiently for a few more minutes to make sure that my pursuers had finally given up and decided to return to the comforts of their homes in this horrible weather. I was panting so hard as I narrowed my eyes at the gate wearily, but they were nowhere in sight. I was about to get back on my feet and somebody suddenly grabbed my wrist and squeezed it tight. I gasped and reflexively cringed away only to have them tighten their grip around my hand. "Thought you could get away that easily, didn't you?" said Alexander, a malicious wide grin plastered across his long pale face. "Get your filthy hands off me," I warned him. "Or what? You're gonna tell your stinking old mommy?" He lets out a Charlotte. "Patrick, he's here! I got him, he's here!" He started shouting at the top of his lungs. I looked around in a panic, but could not see through the heavy downpour of thickening fog blanketing the entire cemetery. Somewhere out there, I could hear Patrick and Harry laughing gleefully as they wandered closer. "I said let me go!" I yelled, trying to pull myself off him. He tightened his grip on my wrist. "Shut up!" he snapped. There was no doubt that it was when the other two finally found us, it would not end well for me. Just like before, they would make sure I ended up going home with a lump or at least a black eye. I heaved as much air into my lungs as I could and stared at Alexander, who was still shouting to lead his friends to us. "Let me go, Alexander," I said in a lower voice, itching my face closer to his. "Oh, I will make you regret this. I'll make your worst nightmares come true." He stopped shouting and frowned at me, his lips pursued making him a mockery of concern. "You're just like your father, aren't you? Didn't he used to beat the shit out of you and your mother a lot when he's drunk? Isn't that why he ended up the way he did?" "What the fuck are you talking about?" He narrowed his eyes at me angrily, but flashes of unpleasant memories from his past were already reflecting in his eyes. I bet you would never hang out with your Patrick if your loser of a father were still around. He beat your ass up just like he used to." A moment of hesitation. He opened his mouth to speak, but my words had triggered something in him, provoked him to relive his horrible childhood under the roof of the abusive father. I swung my wet fist at his face as hard as I could, making sure I hit him where it hurts, but most without actually harming him. His grip loosened and he fell into the heap and started whimpering like a wounded animal. I heaved myself up and away from him, then started running in the opposite direction. "You son of a bitch, I'm gonna kill you!" His anguished and determined cry cut through the air, which prompted me to run even faster towards the waist-high concrete fence that stretched along the steep riverbank south of the cemetery. I jumped over it, and I pushed myself through the thick growth. As the tall grass parted, I came to a halt and stared in horror when I found myself standing at the edge of a deep crevice through which the river was narrowed even more by overgrowth and massive rock formations, its surface raging wildly from all of the stormwater runoff. "Well, well, nowhere to run now, idiot!" a voice called out from behind me. I turned around to see Patrick jumping off the top of the fence with vicious, evil smirk on his face. "You're pretty fast for a little stinking rodent, but not fast enough." He inches closer towards me in an exaggerated slow gait as the other kids followed him. His oversized flannel shirt was untucked and flapping into the wind. He was right. I was either gonna die by drowning or getting my ass kicked by him. I felt my heart rate slowly go down to a crawl. "I'll beat you up until your own mother can't even recognize your face," he continued. As if in slow motion, I watched him raise his hand and swing the baseball bat to my head. I sidestepped it definitely, and he instead ended up hitting Harry, who was standing right next to him, still laughing obviously. There was a sickening thud, and his neck broke and was knocked aside. He fell flat, landing on his back. The other two stood there frozen for a few seconds as the realization of what had just happened dawned on them. Fuck, look what you made me do!" Patrick shrieked as he turned to gaze back at me angrily. "I'm gonna kill you now!" I took a step back in anticipation as he raised his hand again, but suddenly, a blood-curdling shriek cut through the air. It was Alexander. A black, rotted hand had emerged from the bush and was dragging him back to the cemetery as he thrashed around wildly in desperate attempts to free himself. It happened so fast. Though the decayed, bony fingers clamped over his face, his pale complexion was bleached with terror and helplessness. The sound of his scream was cut short as the living corpse yanked him hard over the fence and both disappeared from view. We stood there in shock, unable to comprehend what just happened. For a split second, I thought Patrick was going to attack me again. But he dropped the bat and started walking backwards in terror, trying to keep his distance from whatever just yanked his friend. There was no reprieve from the horror that had just revealed itself to us. His whole body was shaking violently. I could have warned him, but I remained silent as I watched him slip over the edge and down into this crevice. It was too late anyway. He didn't even have time to scream. But I could feel my heart sink to my stomach when I heard a loud, sickening thud as he landed hard on the huge rock below, cracking his skull open. I turned away, took a deep breath, and shuddered. "Hey, you alright?" Tufts of fury red hair appeared from behind the fence, followed by a pale, freckled face that seemed to be emitting a faint bluish glow. Rihanna was beaming broadly. I noticed that tiny droplets of rain were floating around her outline of her slender figure like swarms of flies, as if afraid to touch her. Her voice sounded friendly yet fierce at the same time. A lump closed my throat down. "You should get a cup of hot tea when you get home. You don't want to get sick, do you?" She continued, her accent melodious and intoxicating, as if words were dancing out of her lips when she opened her mouth to speak. I nodded my head stiffly, still gazing at her, unable to break free from my trance. Tufts of her hair were floating around her head independently, unaffected by the wind and rain. She looked down on the lifeless body between us and shook her head. "I've warned these children many times before, but they never listen." She pursed her lips into a mockery of grief. "Maybe I should have just turned them into hares, yes, but it's too late now. Nobody can undo magic that has been unleashed. The storm always arrives on time. I could hear those witches clearly as if they had been whispering in my ear. It was a matter of life and death," she murmured to herself. I was still too stunned to speak or even to move, hypnotized by her sudden appearance. From up close she looked even prettier than I remembered. There was something warm yet dangerous about her as she heaved herself over the fence. "Very well, Harold. I made all your wishes come true in exchange for the most essential ingredient to make my magic potion." She pointed at Harry and lowered her voice. "Bone marrow. Now I have enough supply for the whole year. Thank you." Her eyes were gleaming hardly as she bent down and checked on Harry. "Wishes?" I asked. She turned her gaze back at me and frowned for a few seconds, and then a smile spread across her face again, revealing a perfect set of pearly white teeth. "Mouths are speaking, eyes are watching, and ears are listening everywhere," she whispers mysteriously. "And with a simple magic spell, she snapped her long fingers, made those wishes come true." "Rowena," I stammered, trying to hold back my fear. "Shh. You better get home now. I'll take care of this. Nobody is going to remember these children. I won't tell anybody if you won't. It'll be our little secret." She pressed a finger to her lips and winked. She waved her hand in a repetitive gesture in front of her while uttering some weird words that sounded foreign to my ears. And just like that, the storm suddenly ceased. The wind stopped howling as dark gray clouds parted and receded into the hillside. The afternoon sun was shining again, casting an eerie reddish glow across the land. "Goodbye for now, Harold. Glad to help. Be a good boy, always." She waved at me as I broke free from whatever it was that had kept me in my place for the last few minutes. I nodded my head and started running as fast as I could. I did not stop until I arrived at the old bridge. Later that night, a strange idea flashed across my mind when I was doing my math homework. There were still so many unanswered questions about Rihanna swimming around in my head, and I was burning with curiosity. It was already past midnight when I decided to turn into myself, tearing my assignment sheet into several pieces, balled them up, and threw them out in the open window. I went to bed with a huge grin plastered over my face that night, waiting for morning to arrive. I hope there's still plenty of room in Rihanna's jar of bone powder for another wish.